Hey, and welcome to Be the Bridge. I'm your host, Brian Peyton Joyner. From the time I was 11, I tried to pray away the gay. But my senior year in college, I realized I could pray and be gay. Each week, I'll share my experiences and chat with others as we build a bridge between the LGBT community and people of faith. Thanks for joining, and let the construction begin. Hello, fellow bridge builders. Thank you all for joining me today for this special best of episode of Be the Bridge podcast. I'm your host, Brian Peyton Joyner, author of the novel The Wisdom of Stones. The novel's about Ben, a college senior who promised God and his meemaw he'd be a Southern Baptist preacher, but he can't pray away the gay. My guest today has helped thousands of people better understand the Bible and settle into that sometimes uncomfortable position of being gay and Christian. Daniel Helmeniak's book, What the Bible Really Says About Homosexuality, was first published in 1996 and has sold more than 120,000 copies. I wish I had Daniel's book when I was coming out because it's the most concise and clear analysis of the Bible and how it gets used as weapons against the LGBTQIA+ community. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you, Brian. It's good to be with you again.
Yeah, I interviewed you about 6 months ago, and it's been one of the most popular episodes. And in this Best Of series, I'm re-airing some of the listeners' favorites and revisiting some topics where my audience had questions and wanted more info. Throughout the book, even though you call it What the Bible Says About Homosexuality, you make a real clear distinction up front about how really the Bible's only reference is to Homo Genital contact. Can you explain that word Homo Genital and then why you don't think it relates?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Homo Genital meaning same genitals, same sex organs. And what it's talking about simply, the Bible and the whole of the ancient world had no sense of sexual orientation. They just knew that people had different ways of having sex, and it was all mixed, and most of it in one form or another was allowed with certain restrictions. It was about having sex acts, and that's what that word Homo Genital means. It's trying to take away the notion that the Bible might have understood that there was a thing like sexual orientation.
In Western culture, when did we first even come up with this concept of sexual orientation?
Sexual orientation, probably in the early around 1900, somewhat before. Freud was involved in that. They say that he was a sexual pervert. He wasn't. Sex was the topic of his day. That's why he wrote about it. It was the first time that it was coming out. Richard von Krafft-Ebing was probably one of the people who got into that. He was very concerned. He wrote a book called Pathology, Sexual Pathology. He was interested in the deviances of his day, and he came up with a lot of these distinctions that we never had before. It's part of the scientific mentality, rather than just taking life as it's lived and let people be who they are as long as they're not hurting one another, starting to try to analyze it and understand it and categorize it.
And pathologize it.
Somewhat might be pathologized too, yes, to try to determine where pathology comes in and what is healthy and just diversity, yeah. But it was a scientific mentality that tried to start being applied to sex. And as a result of that, you get sexual orientation.
So let's move on to the topic of abomination. You know, that word is something that as a kid, I remember over and over the preacher from the pulpit just shrieking in a loud voice. And that really resonated and caused me a lot of internal psychological damage, as you could imagine.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
What does that word abomination really mean?
In English, it sounds really bad. And the preacher, I heard one preacher, it's something that makes God want to vomit.
Oh, wow.
I don't think God can vomit, but the meaning, that captures the meaning of the word. It's something that makes you disgusted, something that you dislike, that's distasteful, that's dirty, that's crude. The point is, none of those words I just gave are ethical terms. It's not the same as right or wrong just because something upsets me, because I'm uncomfortable with it. And that is the sense of that word in the scriptures, abomination. If you get technical about it, it's really a fuzzy area. The text in Leviticus, that's 18:22. I'm going to read it just so we know what we're talking about. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. So there's where the abomination comes in. If you want to get literal, the text should really read, you shall not lie the lyings of a woman with a man. It is an abomination, which raises a whole other set of questions. What are these lyings of a woman? But the word abomination there is toiva in the Hebrew. That word is one word. It's said to be the stronger word. The worst offense, a toiva, is used to talk about things that the Hebrew people thought were disgusting, distasteful, and to make a distinction between wrong and disgusting is very difficult in that culture. They had another word, sheketh, which was used in the same way, and it didn't usually have the same sense of the weight. The problem is, if you go through the scriptures, those words get used interchangeably. And besides that, another word that is used for unclean, uncleanliness, that word too gets used. And so how do you translate this thing? If you translate it as abomination and you mean it to be really, really wrong, then you get a sin. If you translate it as an uncleanness, it's the same as the woman having her cycle or a man having an ejaculation or mixing two different seeds in a field, eating crayfish. It's something that in their culture they did not do, and so you don't do this. That leads me to think of the context. That verse about man lying with a man, it only occurs, there's no other reference explicit to homosexual behavior, Homo Genital behavior in the Bible except that one place. And it is in a section of Leviticus that's called the Holiness Code. And the purpose of all of those prescriptions there is to keep Israel different from the other nations. It starts out with something like, you shall not do as the Egyptians did in their way. You shall not do as the Canaanites in your new land. You shall do as I tell you and obey my ordinances. It doesn't say the Egyptians were wrong in what they did. It doesn't say the Canaanites were evil in what they did. It just says, you are my people. You behave in this way. And so there's a whole list of things that the Jews were to do to let the people know that they were Jews, circumcision being one of the major ones.
Now, what about the way that sex was used in other religions that were common at that time?
There's some sense in this word that the Canaanites may have been involved with rituals, sexual rituals around fertility cults. When the springtime comes, you have these wild sexual festivals that are supposed to help the crops grow and bring good weather and that sort of thing. And it may well be that same-sex behavior was part of those things, and for that reason it was called an abomination. That's hidden. If that's the case, we don't know that. The text we're dealing with is built on layers and layers of revision and a new addition, and we have the final word. There's nothing about the Canaanites in that text. What there is that it's a violation of the way the Jews see things. It's unclean. The word again, just to highlight how confusing it is. In Genesis, you get two places where the Egyptians find it unclean, and the same word toiba. It's an offense for the Egyptians. They will not eat with the Hebrews. This is when Joseph's family goes down into Egypt, because you're not supposed to eat with strange people. That's a violation. And they will certainly not eat with the shepherds, because the shepherds deal with animals, and that's dirty. But it's the exact same word, toiva, that's being used to talk about the man lying with man.
That really puts it in perspective there.
If you look closely at the text, too, the same word is being applied to a woman having her period in that little section of the text we're looking at.
So just the natural saying of a woman having her period is toiva.
It's hard to understand what the Jews meant by clean and unclean way back then in the ancient Hebrew world, but it seemed to have something to do with consistency. And for a woman to be bleeding, that is not consistent. It's a break. There's something wrong there. To put two seeds together in the same field, that's not consistent. In their mind, fish were supposed to have fins and were to swim. They're not supposed to have shells and crawl. So there's something wrong with these crayfish and lobsters. It was almost the science of the day. And of course, since God put things together, you would say this is what God wants. But can you jump so quickly from what a culture finds appropriate to itself to what God finds eternally valid and natural in the sense of what ought to be? That's a big jump. And it does not seem that this text was talking about nature. One other issue that makes it to know exactly what the abomination was. It says those lying things, the lying of a woman. There's also the lying of a man. And when a man and a woman share a lying, she is no longer a virgin. So what is specifically being mentioned there is intercourse. The Jews also, the ancient Hebrews also considered anal sex, if with someone else's wife, was adultery. So they were aware of both anal and vaginal intercourse. What is being prohibited there is for a man to penetrate another man, period. There's ample evidence in other commentaries on the scriptures that it was not prohibiting male-male sex, it was prohibiting penetration between two men. And why is that? Because it violates, again, that order, the science of the day. Women are supposed to be penetrated, men are supposed to penetrate. And to cross that line mixes kinds. It's an abomination. It certainly doesn't object to homosexual behavior. It objects to penetrative sexual behavior between two men. And where that would apply, I would think, is just to Orthodox Jews. It's pretty irrelevant, the rest of us.
Right. Well, let's segue now into the New Testament terms that Paul uses, and it's really this notion of natural and unnatural. And I'll let you go into the Greek terms.
Yeah, let me again just read the one line. This is Romans 1, verse 26. The women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way also the men giving up natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion for one another. Now it's real clear that we're talking about men having sex with men. Whether they're talking about lesbianism in this passage is highly questionable. And the reason, if you go up a couple verses to where Paul introduces this thing, he talks about God gave them up to impurity and to degrading behaviors. And later he calls them unseemly behaviors. This is toiva. There's clear reference back to the same descriptions as we saw of that thing, and those are not ethical terms. If you look up everywhere in Paul's writing where he uses those descriptor terms, he never uses them as right or wrong. He said he himself was held in disgrace for preaching Christ. It's the same word that he used to describe these behaviors. Wow. So it can't in itself mean that it was wrong. So that brings us back to this paraphusin, unnatural. Paraphusin. Para, we know paralegal, paramedic, people who work alongside of. The word means over and above or beyond. And physin, the Greek word for nature, you can hear the word physics there, physical, is talking about physical nature, natural things. And so paraphusin is something that is beyond the natural. Now, this word has different meanings. It really comes from Stoic philosophy. It was rampant. It was the philosophy of the day in the Roman Empire in the first century. And almost everybody would have known those words. Like we talk about a quantum leap. And usually when we say a quantum leap, we mean it's a really massive change. Whereas in fact, a quantum leap is the smallest possible change that you could ever have. In other words, the popular usage gets wrong the technical meaning. Now, if Paul were using the technical meaning, paraphusin, it would clearly mean unnatural, against all that nature is about, wrong, evil, destructive. The fact is he's using the popular meaning there. And what it means is unlikely. I think it should be translated atypical. They were doing atypical things. In other words, most people have heterosexual intercourse. They were doing other kinds of things. The clincher on this thing is that if you look in Romans 11:24, Paul talks about God doing unnatural things, if you want to use that word, atypical things. It's about the Greeks, the Jews and the Gentiles. And Paul is saying that the Jews were God's chosen people, but they did not respond to Jesus. So he is bringing the Gentiles as if they were a branch, a wild branch being grafted into this plant that has been cultivated all these centuries, which is the Jews. He's implanting a wild branch into a cultivated branch. Now, I've talked to people who do grafting, and they say that's just the opposite of what you would do. Wild plants tend to grow really vigorously. They grow without the danger of being eliminated. So if you want to do a graft, you take a cultivated plant that's producing really good fruit and you graft it into a wild stump, and it will grow really really vigorously. So God did just the opposite of what people would have been expected. And in that context, Paul not only says that God acted paraphusin, unaccording to nature, he also uses the other Stoic word kataphusin, which means according to nature. And back and forth, he plays off kataphusin and paraphusin, and as it were, tosses them to the wind. And his final line is that God is not constrained by any of these things. What he's talking about could not possibly be sin, saying God doesn't care about what's right or wrong, about what nature is like, how things should function. That would be absurd to think that God, who set the whole thing up, is turning it upside down. But if you understand it to mean atypical, unusual, well, it fits perfectly. God does unusual things. Things occur in ways we would not have expected. And that's the meaning of that word in that text in Romans, in the first chapter. The women were doing things that were not typical for women having sex. We're not real sure what it was the women were doing because up above, as I said, it says they were doing things that were impure. There is no prohibition of lesbian sex in the Bible, certainly not in the Old Testament. And if this text that we're talking about now in Romans 1 is really talking about lesbianism, it is the only place in the Bible that ever gets mentioned. Why is it that women aren't mentioned? They can't penetrate each other. And if they can't penetrate, it doesn't count. It's not real sex. This was the Clinton argument. I did not have sex with that woman. He meant I did not have intercourse. And I understand that Baptist teaching holds some of that, making a distinction. But the point is that if the women were doing things that were unnatural, probably not sex because they couldn't have been doing something impure. It wasn't mentioned. Maybe they were having sex during their menstrual period. In that case, they were doing something that was not typical. The men, on the other hand, clearly it says we're having sex with one another. And that too is atypical. But the other words, unseemly and dishonorable, which describe that thing, those are not ethical terms. Yeah, there's one other thing that, again, to confirm this. If you take the paragraph that talks about sex, he uses these unethical terms, unseemly, atypical, and dishonorable. The next paragraph, the way that's broken up in our Bibles, has a whole list of things that he calls really wrong, ungodly, evil. Not one sexual thing is mentioned in that list. And it seems pretty clear that he is sorting out taboos and cultural mores and trends from real wrong. That's a stage of development morally that a lot of people never get to. That they learned it was wrong and therefore it's a sin. Jumping from what people disapprove of to it making, picking my nose, therefore it's a sin. That kind of thing. Right. Jesus was the one who did that when he said, it's not what you put in your mouth that makes you unclean by breaking the rules. It's what comes out of you because it came from your heart. That's what cleanness is about. And that's the lesson Paul is teaching, using Homo Genital behavior as an example. And later on, he goes to say that we should not be splitting up the Christian church over these things. All things, nothing is unclean in itself. That's the meaning of it. So when you come down to the word, to sum it up, the word unnatural is really mistranslated. If it were translated atypical, it would leave a lot more room to understand what Paul was trying to say. That we shouldn't be fighting over these kinds of things. There's really nothing wrong with them in themselves.
Right, and I love that conclusion at the end of the chapter that you have on looking at the unnatural in Romans, where you make that point crystal clear and chastise some Christians today who want to pick a verse out of context, not looking at the entire argument that Paul was actually making in that letter to the Romans. And in the end, his argument was, don't worry about these things that you think are unclean. Focus on being a community and don't let this divide you. Yes. And it's so ironic that that is what the church is doing today, letting these trivial matters about what's taboo and what's not separate people who have a lot more in common than they do different.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me just make one final statement about this Bible, the emphasis on the Bible. It's real interesting how this text on homosexual behavior, these two we talked about, get highlighted and so much else is ignored. The Bible approved of slavery from beginning to end, and Jesus told parables about it. Well, we've gotten over that. Well, this was a misunderstanding. It was a cultural thing. The Bible also has the earth being flat. Now, the Egyptians knew that the earth was round, and the Greeks knew that the earth was round, but in the Middle East, it was considered to be flat. Now, the Bible's telling us the earth is flat. Well, we'll just pass over that. The one that I really like is that the Bible forbids taking of interest on money, usury. You're not supposed to, when you lend people things, you're supposed to do it in goodwill. And I say my line to that is, where are the fundamentalists today when we need them? Right. Why don't they start talking about the excess money that's being taken on 25% interest on credit cards and things like that? My point is that why we're latching onto one text and not the other is absolutely incoherent. Religion is not rational. We're putting up evidence here. I hope that people can take it, and those who need it will see that much of what's being said about the Bible is simply mistaken. But the hardcore, I don't know what to do with those. But I wish they, for one thing at least, that they start taking care of the environment and start looking at the economic system and the medical system and all that kind of stuff. Start applying biblical values there.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Daniel, so much for coming back and doing a further discussion of these terms in the Bible. I think this is very helpful for people to understand. It was the thing that for me really opened my eyes in terms of what I had been taught versus what was actually there. Uh-huh. And I think that's the real fundamental disconnect a lot of people have, is they don't even look at this. They just think about, this is, no, the Bible's clear. This is what it says. And they say, well, have you ever looked at those verses? And I always encourage people to absolutely pick up your book, What the Bible Really Says About Homosexuality, because it is an incredible, easy to read book that raises a lot of questions and will give anyone a lot of, I think of it more as a shield against what people may say about the LGBTQIA plus community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me here, keeping this thing alive, even though I wish the whole thing would die off and the book would stop selling because of it. Yeah. But for you to do this work, I'm really grateful that others, I'm retiring this year from my academic position, but it's nice to see other people picking up the ball and running with it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Daniel. Have a good one.
You too. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to Be the Bridge. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love a positive rating and review on iTunes. I appreciate your support and feedback. For more details, visit brianpaytonjoyner.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter. The links are in the show notes. Have a great week. And as my grandpa used to say, if you live life by your own rules, you're gonna be okay.